It commenced, as all truly profound horrors are wont to do, with a seemingly innocuous deviation from the accustomed order of things, a subtle discord in the symphony of the known world that, in its initial presentation, scarcely warranted more than a raised eyebrow of professional curiosity. My name is Daniel Baker, and though I have, through the span of a considerable career, devoted my faculties to the meticulous dissection of corporeal maladies and the intricate mechanics of human suffering, nothing in my extensive annals of cases, nor in the musty tomes of medical history, had prepared me for the peculiar affliction that arrived on my laboratory, this chilled slab one bleak November morn. The specimen, delivered under the strictest protocol from a quarantined rural infirmary, was initially catalogued as an extreme, albeit rare, case of tissue necrosis. Yet, even through the glass of its hermetically sealed container, a certain unwholesome luminescence, a faint internal scintillation, pulsed from its unnatural bulk, hinting at an etiology far removed from the terrestrial pathogens I was accustomed to confronting. My initial dispatches, penned with a hand still steady, spoke of unprecedented cellular degeneration and a rapid, aggressive proliferation of anomalous structures, utterly devoid of any discernible biological analogue. The very air within my private annex, usually imbued with the crisp, sterile scent of antiseptics and the faint metallic tang of instruments, began to acquire a peculiar, almost fungal dampness, a pervasive chill that crept into the very marrow of my bones. Quite unrelated to the external temperature, my feline companion Silas, a creature of hitherto imperturbable disposition and a connoisseur of sunbeams, began to exhibit a pronounced aversion to the corner where the specimen resided. He would arch his back, his fur bristling with an unseen electric charge, emitting low guttural growls, directed not at any tangible intruder, but at the very space around the insulated container, his emerald eyes wide with an intelligence that seemed to pierce veils I could not perceive. It was not merely the grotesque appearance of the tissue, which, upon closer inspection, revealed a ghastly mosaic of crystalline growths interspersed with pulsating, vein-like filaments of an unknown composition, but the unnerving rapidity of its changes. Each morning, the specimen seemed to have undergone a further metamorphosis, its mass increasing, its internal light growing brighter, its form subtly shifting, like a slow-motion nightmare unfolding within its sterile prison. My instruments, calibrated with painstaking precision, registered anomalous energy fluctuations, patterns of biological activity that defied every known principle of life and decay. The sheer alienness of it all began to suggest the need for a xenobiologist, a field I had, until now, considered the sole province of speculative fiction. My nights became a fractured tapestry of fitful sleep and waking dread. The silence of the laboratory, once a sanctuary for my contemplative studies, now pressed upon my senses with an almost suffocating weight, pregnant with unspoken horrors. I found myself scrutinizing the very walls, the familiar contours of my equipment, searching for subtle alterations, for nascent growths, for the insidious spread of whatever unhallowed influence emanated from the specimen. The internal light of the tissue, now visibly brighter even through the opaque container, cast long, wavering shadows across the floor, dancing with a malevolent, almost sentient rhythm. My own hands, which had so deftly navigated the delicate landscapes of human anatomy, now felt strangely clumsy, tainted, as if the very touch of the thing had begun a subtle corruption within my own corporeal frame. I recall one particularly harrowing evening, amidst the solitude of my lamplit chamber, when a faint, guttural sound like the slow tearing of wet parchment seemed to issue from the direction of the laboratory, a sound that Silas perched upon my desk heard too, for his head snapped up, his ears swiveling with an intensity that sent a fresh wave of icy apprehension through my breast. The chilling truth began to coalesce in my mind with an unwelcome, undeniable clarity. This was no mere disease, no terrestrial pathogen, but something else entirely, a form of life, or perhaps a life, that operated by an entirely different set of rules. The most recent log entry, dated a mere 28 hours prior, had documented a doubling in the specimen's overall mass, a rate of growth that utterly defied the established parameters of any biological process known to man. The crystalline structures which had initially appeared as inert formations now pulsed faintly, their facets reflecting the internal light with an unnerving, almost intelligent shimmer. My professional detachment had long since dissolved, replaced by a profound and primal fear. This was not a case to be solved, but a burgeoning terror, a creeping invasion perhaps that threatened to unravel the very foundations of my understanding of existence. The quiet hum of the laboratory equipment, once a reassuring drone, now seemed to murmur with an unheard, alien language, a prelude to a transformation I felt powerless to halt and utterly incapable of comprehending. The distinct, sickly sweet aroma, which had subtly pervaded the air, began to thicken, to cling to my clothes, my skin, a pervasive scent of decay, and something profoundly, chillingly new. The peculiar affliction of the specimen, which had already begun to gnaw at the very edifice of my scientific understanding, now commenced its more insidious work upon the corporeal and psychological fabric of my being. My initial attempts at further analysis, undertaken with the scrupulous rigor demanded by my profession, yielded only a deeper plunge into the abyss of the inexplicable. The microtome, with its accustomed precision, refused to cleave a clean section from the pulsating mass. Its blade, though freshly honed, seemed to encounter not tissue, but a substance of impossible density, warping and deflecting with a faint, resonant hum that set my teeth on edge. The very glass of the containment vessel, designed to withstand the most corrosive agents, now bore minute, almost imperceptible etchings, like the tracery of some internal parasite attempting to burrow outwards. My optical instruments, through which I had so often peered into the hidden worlds of cellular life, revealed not merely anomalous growths, but a complex self-organizing architecture that pulsed with a life utterly alien to our terrestrial biology. A lattice of crystalline conduits, seemingly channeling the unwholesome light from within. Silas, my discerning familiar, no longer merely bristled at its presence, but now observed it with an unwavering, almost hypnotic intensity. His pupils dilated to twin voids in the dim laboratory light, a low, continuous rumble emanating from his chest. A sound less of warning than of profound, primordial terror. The pervasive dampness, which had previously been but a subtle inconvenience, now condensed upon the cold surfaces of the laboratory, forming beads of an oleaginous moisture that possessed a faintly phosphorescent sheen under the failing gaslight. It was not merely humidity, for its presence seemed to emanate directly from the specimen, drawing the very vital essence from the surrounding air, leaving in its wake a chilling vacuum that pressed upon the tympanum. My own breath, once a robust exhalation, now seemed shallow, caught in a chest that felt strangely constricted. The insidious scent, a sickly amalgamation of decay and an unidentifiable cloying sweetness, had intensified to an almost intolerable degree, clinging to my nostrils, my tongue, even it seemed permeating the very pores of my skin. I began to perceive fleeting reflections in the polished surfaces of my equipment, not of my own haggard countenance, but of something else, something indistinct and shifting. At the very periphery of my vision, an ephemeral shimmer that vanished the moment I turned my gaze directly upon it. These apparitions, coupled with the relentless internal glow of the specimen, began to erode the steadfast certainties of my rational mind, planting the insidious seeds of doubt as to the very nature of my perception, the isolated nature of my studies. Once a cherished solitude, now felt like a prison, sealing me within the expanding sphere of this nascent horror. My attempts to convey the gravity of my findings to my distant colleagues through the archaic medium of telegraphy met with an unnerving silence, or worse, with replies so utterly devoid of comprehension as to suggest a deliberate misunderstanding. Necrotic tissue, one dispatch read, requires standard sterilization and disposal. Your unusual descriptive language is noted. The implication was clear. My sanity was being questioned. This compounded my isolation, for I found myself increasingly reluctant to articulate the truly profound, unsettling truth of the specimen, that it was not merely diseased, but why alive in a manner that defied definition, and that its growth was not merely quantitative but qualitatively transformative. The internal light, no longer a mere glow, now pulsed with a deliberate rhythmic beat, like a monstrous heart, its illumination casting grotesque, elongated shadows that seemed to writhe and stretch with a malevolent sentience. I observed, with a growing dread that constricted my throat, that the very air seemed to shimmer within its immediate vicinity, as if the fabric of reality itself were being subtly warped by its alien emanations. Silas, my usually stoic companion, now refused to enter the laboratory chamber at all, remaining crouched by the threshold, his fur a perpetual storm of static electricity, his low growls escalating into sharp, distressed cries that tore at the fragile remnants of my composure. The very structural integrity of my venerable laboratory, a bastion of scientific inquiry for decades, began to manifest subtle, yet profoundly disturbing, alterations. Fine hairline fissures, previously absent, now spider-webbed across the ancient plaster of the walls, emanating from the corner where the specimen resided. The wooden floorboards, aged and sturdy, began to groan and creak with an unnatural regularity, sounds that were not the accustomed settling of old timber, but something more deliberate, a resonant vibration that seemed to answer the pulsing rhythm of the specimen's internal light. One evening, as the shadows lengthened and deepened, and the sickly sweet effluvium thickened to an almost palpable fog, a small ornate clock, a cherished heirloom perched upon my desk, suddenly ceased its measured ticking, its hands frozen at 3:15. A moment later, with a faint internal foot clink, its glass face shattered inwards, not from any external force, but as if struck by a concussive wave from within. My heart leaped into my throat, a cold, clammy hand seemingly closing around it. This was no longer merely a biological anomaly. It was an active, pervasive influence, a malevolent presence that sought to unravel the very order of things, beginning with the inanimate objects that formed the bulwarks of my accustomed reality. The horror was no longer contained. Sleep became an impossible luxury, haunted by vivid, phantasmagoric visions that blurred the line between waking terror and nocturnal torment. I saw not the specimen, but its fectse, landscapes of pulsating crystal and living, fibrous masses that choked the light from the sky, a world consumed by an unnatural iridescent growth. The very silence of the night, once a balm, now seemed to throb with an unheard, alien language, a chorus of whispers that insinuated themselves into the deepest recesses of my mind. Silas, who had always shared my bed, now kept a wary distance, his eyes fixed on the laboratory door, his tail a perpetual nervous twitch. I found myself pacing the confined space of my study, my gaze repeatedly drawn to the heavy oak door that separated me from the burgeoning horror within the laboratory, a door that suddenly seemed terribly thin, woefully inadequate. The oppressive chill, the pervasive odor, the rhythmic light twined. These were no longer confined to the annex, but seeped into every corner of my habitation, a constant, sickening reminder. I began to feel a subtle, creeping sensation beneath my own skin, an itch that was not an itch, a faint internal vibration that mimicked the pulse of the specimen, a chilling intimation that the corruption was not merely external, but had begun its insidious work upon my very person. The air itself seemed to crackle with an unseen energy, and as I cast a final, desperate glance towards the door, I perceived, with a sickening lurch of my stomach, a faint, almost imperceptible fin bulge in the ancient wood, as if something from within pressed outward subtly, inexorably, against the barrier. The subtle, yet undeniably present, deformation upon the ancient oak of the laboratory door, a faint swell as if some internal pressure sought egress, proved to be the precipitating factor that finally shattered the last vestiges of my scientific detachment. No longer could I merely observe, the horror had begun its inexorable thrust against the very boundaries of my sanctuary. My hand, trembling with a mixture of dread and a peculiar unsettling curiosity, reached out to touch the affected wood. It was not merely warped, it possessed a strange yielding quality, a softness beneath the venerable grain, as if the timber itself had begun to putrefy from within, or had been subjected to a sustained, unholy mollification. A faint, cloying dampness adhered to my fingertips, reminiscent of the oleaginous moisture that now filmed the surfaces within the laboratory. Silas, my feline sentinel, whose distress had reached an alarming pitch, no longer merely cried out, but now scratched insistently at my trousers, his claws snagging the fabric. His small body vibrating with an intensity that mirrored the unseen tremors I felt deep within my own bones. He then fled, with a desperate low whine, to conceal himself beneath a heavy, upholstered armchair, a refuge he had never before sought, leaving me alone to confront the burgeoning menace. The faint, rhythmic pulse that had become the terrible heartbeat of my laboratory now seemed to resonate directly through the door, a palpable throb against my palm, a soundless articulation of its grotesque vitality. My attempts to reinforce the door, employing whatever implements I could lay my shaking hands upon, a heavy iron bar, a stout wooden beam wrenched from an unused shelf, proved utterly futile. The wood, though seemingly solid, offered a strangely pliant resistance, as if it had become imbued with a yielding, organic quality. Nails bent, screws failed to bite, and the very act of exerting force seemed to elicit a faint, guttural groan from the other side, a sound that carried a chilling resonance, suggesting not wood under duress, but something animate struggling against my efforts. The air itself, thick with the pervasive, sickly sweet effluvium, now seemed to press against my very eardrums, creating a sensation of muffled unreality, as though I had plunged into a subterranean chamber where the accustomed laws of atmosphere no longer held sway. My breath, already shallow, grew ragged, each inhalation carrying the cloying scent deeper into my lungs, a sensation not unlike breathing powdered chalk laced with something foul and floral. The internal vibrations, which had hitherto been but a subtle disquiet, now intensified, a persistent, low thrumming that seemed to emanate from the very marrow of my bones, a horrifying counterpoint to the relentless pulse beyond the door, as if my own corporeal frame had begun to resonate in sympathy with the monstrous presence. The relentless drain on my faculties, both mental and physical, had by this point reduced me to a haggard simulacrum of my former self. Sleep had become an almost forgotten luxury, replaced by a waking nightmare of heightened senses and encroaching paranoia. My reflection in the occasional polished surface revealed eyes sunken and bloodshot, skin pallid and drawn, with a faint, almost iridescent sheen that I could not account for, a ghostly luminescence that seemed to emanate from beneath the very surface of my skin. The constant, unearthly light from the laboratory, now visible as a diffuse, pulsing radiance that seeped through the ill-fitting doorframe and beneath the gap at the floor, began to cast its unwholesome glow upon the familiar objects of my study, transforming them into grotesque, unfamiliar shapes. The shadows it conjured were not merely an absence of light, but possessed a strange, almost viscous quality, like living ink spreading across the floor, clinging to the furniture with an unnatural tenacity. The very silence of the house, once a cherished companion, now felt like a heavy shroud, amplifying every creak of the old timbers, every imagined rustle, every beat of my own frantic heart, until the world seemed to throb with a single, unholy rhythm. A more direct assault on the integrity of my habitation commenced with a series of unsettling manifestations. The hairline fissures that had appeared on the walls of the laboratory now extended, like an intricate network of arterial veins into the adjacent study, tracing erratic paths across the plaster, each fine line seemingly pulsating with a faint, internal light that mimicked the larger horror beyond the door. From these cracks, a fine, almost imperceptible dust, possessing the same sickly sweet aroma, began to sift into the room, settling on my papers, my books, covering everything with a thin, unwholesome veil. Then came the sound, a distinct, chitinous scraping, not from within the specimen container, but from twinned within the walls themselves, a burrowing, gnawing noise that spoke of a pervasive, subterranean activity. It was the sound of something vast and unseen, tunneling through the very fabric of my home, using the ancient mortar and lath as its medium. Silas, from his hiding place, let out a series of short, sharp, almost human-like cries, a testament to a terror that transcended mere animal instinct. The faint bulge in the door was now more pronounced, forming a distinct protuberant mound, as if something vast and amorphous pressed its weight against the barrier, shaping it to its own unhallowed dimensions. The terrible truth, which my rational mind had so desperately resisted, now stood undeniable before me. The horror was no longer confined to the specimen, nor even to the laboratory. It was actively expanding, a living cancerous growth that sought to subsume its surroundings, incorporating the very architecture of my home into its monstrous being. The internal vibrations within my own person, which had been a mere sensation, now manifested as a faint, localized tremor beneath the skin of my left forearm, a strange, creeping pulsation that mirrored the rhythmic throb from beyond the door. I stared at the door, now visibly straining, the wood groaning with an almost organic timber, and understood with chilling certainty that the breach was not merely imminent, but inevitable. The pervasive, cloying dampness intensified, coalescing into visible droplets that ran down the walls of my study, not of water, but of a viscous, faintly glowing fluid that smelled of decay and something profoundly, chillingly new. As I watched, a thin, almost translucent filament, resembling a root or a tendril, slowly, tentatively, began to push its way through one of the newly formed cracks in the wall, swaying with an unnerving, deliberate motion in the oppressive air. The horror had found its way out. The sight of that first, tentative tendril, worming its way from the ancient plaster, was a more profound and immediate violation than any structural groan or spectral shimmer, for it represented the tangible, undeniable breach of the barrier betwixt the known and the utterly monstrous. It was thin, at first scarcely thicker than a darning needle, yet possessed of a sickening gelatinous translucence, a pallid grey-green hue that caught the ambient gloom of my study with an unnatural internal gleam, as if it pulsed with a faint, cold vitality of its own. Its surface was not smooth, but faintly striated, with minute, almost microscopic filaments that twitched and retracted with a disturbing exploratory sentience. My breath caught in my throat, a dry, rasping sound in the suffocating quiet. I felt a profound, visceral revulsion, yet my gaze was fixed, unable to tear itself from the slow, deliberate uncoiling of this alien appendage. Silas, from his ignominious refuge beneath the armchair, emitted a low, continuous growl, a sound more akin to a choked sob. His eyes, reflecting the dim light, were fixed upon the emerging horror with an intensity of terror that spoke volumes. The oppressive dampness in the air seemed to congeal around this nascent manifestation, condensing into visible rivulets that traced glistening paths down the cracked wall, carrying with them that pervasive, sickly sweet effluvium that now seemed to possess a more acrid, aggressive edge. The tendril itself appeared to be testing the very air, its tips swaying with a slow serpentine undulation, as if sniffing for some unseen sustenance. With a deliberate, almost cautious grace, the tendril extended further, gaining in thickness and substance with each passing moment, shedding its initial fragility for a more robust, almost cartilaginous form. It moved not with the hurried urgency of a searching root, but with the slow, inexorable deliberation of something that knew its dominion was assured. As it lengthened, its pallid hue deepened, acquiring faint, almost imperceptible striations of a deeper, venous red, as though a rudimentary circulatory system had begun its work within its alien structure. The air around it, already heavy with the miasma, now shimmered with an intensified heat, a localized warmth that belied the pervasive chill of the room, suggesting some peculiar metabolic process at work, an internal furnace feeding upon unseen energies. I found myself instinctively recoiling, my hand reaching for a heavy brass letter opener on my desk, a futile gesture against a horror so utterly beyond the mundane. Yet, a morbid fascination, a vestige of my scientific training, compelled me to observe its every subtle movement, to chronicle its vile progression. The tendril, now nearly a foot in length, began to palpate the surface of my ancient oak desk, its tip making minute, circular motions, leaving behind a faint, glistening residue that evaporated with a sizzle, emitting a wisp of that cloying, corrosive aroma. It was probing, assessing, and I felt, with a chilling certainty, that it was assessing Twine-Mish. The initial tendril was soon joined by others, smaller, yet no less unsettling, pushing through adjacent fissures in the plaster, like a monstrous vegetative eruption. These secondary filaments, thinner and more numerous, writhed and intertwined, forming a grotesque, burgeoning network that pulsed with the same unwholesome light, a living tapestry of alien growth upon my study wall. The very wood of the door, already yielding, now seemed to soften and swell further, the faint bulge becoming a more pronounced, almost tumescent mound, from which a viscous greenish ichor began to weep, running in slow, glistening trails down its venerable surface, staining the polished floorboards beneath. A new sound now joined the cacophony of my torment, a faint, persistent, clicking, a dry, percussive rhythm that seemed to emanate from within the walls, as if countless tiny, chitinous mandibles gnawed at the very foundations of my home. My hands, still clutching the useless letter opener, began to tremble uncontrollably, a tremor that spread throughout my entire frame, culminating in a profound internal shiver that racked my very bones. Silas, in his hiding place, had ceased his growling, now merely trembling, a silent, quivering bundle of fur, his gaze fixed upon the proliferating horror with an unblinking catatonic dread. The air became thick with a fine, almost invisible particulate, like airborne motes of the specimen itself, clinging to my hair, my clothing, infusing my very pores with its unholy essence, leaving a gritty, metallic taste upon my tongue. The transformation of my study, once a bastion of order and intellect, was proceeding with a horrific alacrity. The tendrils, now thick as my wrist in places, had begun to fuse and branch, forming grotesque, root-like structures that gripped the wall with an alarming tenacity, their pallid surfaces glistening with the same oleaginous ooze. One particularly robust appendage, having fully explored the surface of my desk, now turned its attention to a shelf of prized medical texts, its tip making contact with the leather-bound spines, which upon its touch seemed to soften and darken, as if instantly aged by centuries, their intricate gold tooling fading to a dull, sickly brown. The pervasive, rhythmic pulse that had so tormented me from beyond the door now seemed to emanate directly from this living network, a slow, deliberate beat that reverberated through the very floorboards, vibrating through the soles of my boots, up into my legs, and into the very core of my being. I felt a peculiar, unsettling sensation of warmth spreading through my left arm, the same arm where I had previously detected the faint, internal tremor, a warmth that was not comforting but insidious, accompanied by a faint, prickling itch that seemed to originate not on the surface of my skin, but deeper within the muscle and sinew. My mind, assaulted by the sensory overload and the relentless assault on my rational faculties, began to fray at the edges, my thoughts becoming fragmented, disjointed, like torn pages from an ancient manuscript. I understood, with a terrible crystalline clarity, that the specimen was not merely growing, but assimilating, transforming inert matter into its own monstrous, alien flesh. The house itself was becoming a part of it, and I feared I too was destined for a similar unholy metamorphosis. A particularly thick tendril, now fully extended from the wall, began to writhe slowly, its tip hovering directly before my face, emitting a faint, almost imperceptible hum that resonated in the very hollows of my skull, a silent, terrible invitation. The proximity of that grotesque tendril, its tip quivering with an unseen energy mere inches from my face, represented the nadir of my resistance. The moment when the last vestiges of my scientific composure utterly collapsed into a primal, visceral terror. Its surface, now a mottled grey, green with deeper, almost purplish striations, gleamed with a sickly internal luminosity, and from its pores exuded a faint, acrid mist that carried the intensified, cloying aroma directly into my nostrils, burning with a chemical intensity. I could discern with horrifying clarity minute, hair-like cilia along its length, which twitched and writhed with an unsettling autonomy like 1,000 tiny unseen mouths tasting the air. A profound coldness, sharper and more invasive than any I had yet experienced, seemed to emanate directly from this abhorrent appendage, chilling the very blood within my veins, yet paradoxically the localized heat around its base intensified, creating a sickening thermal paradox that disoriented my senses. My breath, already shallow, hitched in my throat, a dry, rattling gasp, as my muscles locked in a desperate, unthinking paralysis. Silas, from his hidden refuge, let out a single, piercing shriek, a sound of such profound despair that it momentarily pierced the fog of my terror, reminding me of the imminent danger that now encompassed not merely my person, but the very sanctity of my domestic world. The tendril, with a slow, deliberate grace, began to trace an invisible arc in the air before my eyes, its movements possessing an unnerving intelligence, as if it were performing some arcane preparatory ritual. The initial touch, when it came, was not the blunt force I had instinctively braced for, but a delicate, almost exploratory caress, as the tip of the tendril brushed against my cheek, just below my left eye. It was not merely cold, it possessed a peculiar, almost electrical quality, a faint tingling sensation that instantly numbed the skin it contacted, spreading outwards in a rapid, insidious wave. The surface felt strangely smooth, yet inherently alien, like polished chitin or some petrified fungal growth, yielding slightly beneath the pressure, yet utterly devoid of the warmth of living tissue. A faint, almost imperceptible suction accompanied its passage, as if it were drawing something imperceptible from my very skin. The cloying aroma intensified, filling my mouth with a dry, metallic taste, like old copper left out in a storm. My vision blurred for a moment, the room seeming to spin, and for an instant I perceived not my study, but a swirling vortex of green and purple light, a chaotic vista of crystalline spires and pulsing fibrous masses before the familiar, albeit distorted, reality reasserted itself. The internal tremor in my left arm, which had been a subtle disquiet, now intensified, becoming a distinct, rhythmic throb, a counterpoint to the alien pulse that resonated from the burgeoning growth upon the wall. The tendril, having completed its initial, chilling reconnaissance, now retracted slightly, its tip poised, quivering, as if awaiting a further command from some unseen central intelligence. The insidious nature of the horror revealed itself further as the tendril, with a renewed, deliberate motion, began to move towards my left eye. A cold dread far beyond mere apprehension gripped me. I tried to recoil, to pull back, but my limbs felt weighted, my muscles unresponsive, as if a profound invisible force held me in an iron grip, my breath stalled, my chest tightening with a suffocating terror. The air around the tendril now crackled with a faint, almost inaudible hum, a sound that seemed to resonate directly within the hollows of my skull, accompanied by a sudden intense pressure behind my eyes, as if they were being subtly, inexorably drawn outwards. I could perceive, with a horrific clarity, the minute individual cilia on the tendril's tip, each one seeming to twitch with an anticipatory hunger. A faint, sickening warmth, distinct from the external cold, began to spread from the point where the tendril had touched my cheek, a warmth that felt unnatural, invasive, as if something had been subtly front-implanted beneath my skin. The pervasive, rhythmic pulse from the wall growth intensified, throbbing with a malevolent vitality that seemed to mock the frantic beat of my own heart. Silas, from his hiding place, let out a series of frantic, choked whimpers, his small body pressed flat against the floor, his terror a palpable, suffocating wave in the already oppressive atmosphere. As the tendril's tip, now visibly engorged, hovered precariously close to my left eye, a profound internal shift seemed to occur within my very being. The external world, with its tendrils and its pervasive stench, began to recede, replaced by a strange inner sensation of expansion, of growth. It was not a pleasant feeling, but one of profound, alien transformation, as if my own internal landscape were being subtly remapped, rewired. A sudden sharp pain lanced through my left eye, a searing, blinding agony that tore a choked cry from my lips. For a fleeting, horrifying moment, I saw not with my accustomed vision, but through a filter of green and purple, a kaleidoscopic nightmare of swirling geometric patterns, pulsing with an unbearable alien light. The pain subsided as quickly as it came, leaving behind a persistent, dull ache and a profound sense of disorientation. The tendril, with a final, almost tender caress, withdrew fully, retracting slowly back into the fissure from which it had emerged, its pallid surface now glistening with an oily sheen. It left behind on my cheek not merely the numbing cold and the strange warmth, but a faint, almost imperceptible mark, a minute, star-shaped indentation that pulsed faintly with the same unwholesome light that emanated from the wall growth. The air, though still thick with the cloying effluvium, seemed to vibrate with a renewed, more profound energy, a silent, triumphant hum. My vision, though no longer blurred, seemed subtly altered, as if a thin, iridescent film now overlay my left eye, lending a faint, greenish cast to the familiar contours of my study. The colors appeared more vivid, yet simultaneously more sinister, imbued with an unnatural vibrancy that twisted their accustomed forms. I could now perceive, with a chilling clarity, minute, almost microscopic details in the burgeoning wall growth that had previously been invisible to my naked eye, tiny pulsating pores, delicate, crystalline filaments that wove through its substance, and a faint, internal luminescence that seemed to shift and flow with an unsettling, intelligent rhythm. The internal tremor in my left arm had now intensified to a persistent, rhythmic throb, and as I looked down, I perceived, with a sickening lurch of my stomach, a faint, almost imperceptible network of fine greenish veins, newly visible beneath the pallid surface of my skin, tracing patterns eerily similar to those on the tendril itself. The pervasive, sickly sweet aroma now seemed to possess a strange, almost comforting quality, a testament to the insidious corruption that had begun its work not merely around me, but within with me. Silas, from his hiding place, let out another despairing cry, his gaze fixed not on the wall, but directly upon me, his emerald eyes wide with a terror that spoke of a monstrous transformation, a new unholy presence in the room. I raised my left hand, turning it slowly, and saw, with a dawning horror, a faint, iridescent shimmer clinging to my fingertips, a peculiar crystalline dust that pulsed with the same unwholesome light. The assimilation had begun. The star-shaped indentation upon my cheek, left by the receding tendril, became the focal point of a new, insidious corruption, for it pulsed not merely with an unwholesome light, but with a throbbing ache that seemed to resonate deep within the very bone structure of my cranium. My left eye, now veiled by that iridescent film, perceived the world with a sickening clarity, an unnatural acuity that revealed hidden textures and minute imperfections in the familiar surfaces of my study, yet rendered all in a hue of sickly Viridian, as if viewed through a pane of diseased glass. The vibrant colors of my books, the warm tones of the mahogany desk, were all subsumed by this pervasive, bilious tint, giving the entire chamber the appearance of being submerged beneath stagnant, phosphorescent water. The internal tremor in my left arm, which had been a disquieting sensation, now intensified to a persistent, almost rhythmic spasm, visible beneath the skin, where the network of greenish veins had become strikingly pronounced, tracing a grotesque, arboreal pattern from wrist to shoulder. Silas, from his cowering position, no longer merely whimpered, but emitted a soft, mournful cry, his gaze fixed upon my transformed arm, his terror now tinged with a profound, almost human sorrow, as if he mourned the man I was swiftly ceasing to be. The pervasive, cloying aroma of the burgeoning growth no longer seemed merely external, but had begun to emanate, subtly, from my own person, a faint, sweet decay that clung to my breath, a chilling intimation of internal metamorphosis. A peculiar disquietude, deeper than mere fear, began to settle upon my spirit, an unsettling sense of internal dissonance. My thoughts, once so rigorously ordered, now presented themselves in fragmented bursts, interspersed with fleeting, alien impressions that felt not like my own, but as if some extraneous consciousness sought to insinuate itself into the very chambers of my mind. I found myself drawn, with an irresistible, almost compulsive fascination, towards the pulsating wall growth, my altered vision revealing an intricate, almost intelligent design within its chaotic proliferation. a complex lattice of crystalline conductors and fibrous conduits that pulsed with a synchronized internal rhythm. The faint, persistent clicking from within the walls intensified, no longer merely an ambient horror, but now possessed of a strange, almost musical quality, a dry, percussive symphony that seemed to resonate directly with the internal tremor in my arm, and indeed with a newfound, subtle throb that had commenced behind my left ear. My skin, beneath the clothing, felt strangely taut, yet also peculiarly permeable, as if the very surface of my corporeal form had begun to soften to lose its accustomed resilience. I raised my hand, the one adorned with the grotesque green tracery, and tentatively touched a section of the burgeoning wall growth. The touch was not repulsive, as it ought to have been, but conveyed a strange, almost vibrant energy, a subtle hum that resonated through my bones, a horrifying communion. The faint, star-shaped mark upon my cheek began to deepen in hue, taking on a more pronounced, almost iridescent green, and from its center, a minute almost imperceptible pore seemed to open, exhaling a faint wisp of that same acrid, cloying mist that accompanied the tendrils. My sense of taste, already corrupted by the metallic tang, now registered an unsettling sweetness in the very air, a pervasive, almost palpable flavor that clung to my palate as if I had consumed some unholy confection. The growth upon the walls, now unchecked, had spread with alarming alacrity, its pallid root-like structures having fully encompassed my desk, crawling over the heavy oak and burrowing into the leather-bound volumes, which now appeared shriveled and brittle, their pages warped into stiff parchment. Like scrolls, the hum from the wall growth, previously subtle, had now escalated to a low, continuous drone, a resonant vibration that filled the room, making the very air feel thick and viscous, difficult to move through. Silas, abandoning his armchair refuge, now paced the far periphery of the study, his movements jerky and agitated, his eyes never leaving me, his low, distressed cries now punctuated by sharp, almost panicked barks, sounds I had never heard from him before. A desperate plea, or warning. The peculiar warmth in my left arm had spread, encompassing my entire left side, a pervasive, insidious heat that felt less like fever and more like a slow internal combustion, a transformation of my very essence. As the hours bled into an indistinguishable continuum of dread, the boundaries of my own identity began to blur, dissolving into the encroaching alien presence. I found myself instinctively understanding the rhythms of the wall growth, anticipating its subtle shifts, perceiving a nascent collective intelligence within its vast, sprawling network. My left eye, with its verdant filter, seemed to grant me a new mode of perception, allowing me to discern patterns of energy, unseen currents that flowed through the very fabric of the house, emanating from the laboratory and coursing through the tendrils into the walls, and I horrifyingly realized, inter time, the relentless gnawing and clicking within the timbers of my home intensified, a symphony of organic consumption, as the house itself groaned and shuddered, no longer merely an old structure settling, but a living entity undergoing a monstrous metamorphosis. The very floorboards beneath my feet now felt strangely yielding, as if they had become infused with a spongy, organic resilience, and from their cracks, a delicate, almost invisible mist of that pervasive sweet effluvium now rose, clinging to my boots. My internal tremor had spread to my chest, a profound resonant throb that echoed the relentless pulse of the burgeoning horror, a horrifying synchronicity between my fading humanity and its ascendant, alien life. The greenish veins upon my left arm had begun to deepen further, acquiring a faint, almost crystalline sheen, and from their surface, minute, almost imperceptible filaments, like those on the tendril that had touched me, now began to sprout, fine as spider silk, yet stiff and strangely resilient to the touch. The star-shaped mark on my cheek, now a luminous emerald, pulsed with an undeniable internal light, its central pore exhaling a continuous visible wisp of acrid mist. My throat felt constricted, my voice hoarse and alien when I attempted to speak, as if my vocal cords too had begun their unholy transformation. Silas, in a final act of desperation, leapt onto my lap, his claws digging into my trousers, his small head pressed against my chest, as if seeking comfort, yet simultaneously shaking with an uncontrollable terror, his frantic purr a desperate broken thing. He looked up at me, his emerald eyes wide, reflecting not the man he had known, but something else, something monstrous and profoundly shy-other, his gaze piercing the veil of my fading humanity. As I stared back, my altered vision now revealed a faint, almost imperceptible luminescence emanating from foot within his own fur, a terrifying premonition of the pervasive corruption. The air within the study had become a palpable viscous substance, shimmering with an unseen energy, and as I raised my hands, I saw that the crystalline dust that clung to my fingertips was no longer merely dust, but had begun to coalesce into minute, faceted growths, like tiny living jewels. Sparkling with the same unwholesome light, a grotesque jewelry of my own burgeoning transformation. The assimilation was complete, save for the final, dreadful surrender of consciousness. The crystalline growths, which had manifested as but minute, sparkling motes upon my fingertips, now began their insidious proliferation, hardening into distinct, multifaceted structures that emerged from beneath the skin of my left hand, lending it a grotesque, mineral beauty that defied all biological understanding. Each facet shimmered with the same unwholesome, Viridian light that now cast a permanent pallor over my vision, refracting the ambient gloom into a kaleidoscopic nightmare of shifting, angular forms. The delicate filaments that had sprouted from the greenish veins upon my left arm had lengthened, intertwining into a fine, almost translucent web that stretched from my wrist to my shoulder, clinging to my skin with an unnerving tenacity, like a second, external circulatory system. The star-shaped mark upon my cheek, now a luminous emerald, pulsed with an accelerated rhythm, its central pore exhaling a continuous stream of the acrid mist that had become the very air I breathed, tasting of sweet decay and something profoundly inorganic. Silas, whose frantic purr had been reduced to a ragged, choked gasp, now lay motionless upon my lap, his small body trembling with a profound internal vibration, the faint luminescence in his fur having intensified to a visible, shimmering aura that pulsed faintly in synchronicity with the throbbing within my own breast. His emerald eyes, once so bright with feline intelligence, were now wide and unfocused, fixed upon some unseen horror that only he could perceive, a silent, terrible witness to my burgeoning transformation. My consciousness, once a singular, coherent entity, had become a fractured, composite thing, a disquieting amalgamation of my own fading thoughts and the burgeoning alien intelligence that now surged within my very being. The familiar processes of human reason were increasingly supplanted by a strange, intuitive understanding of the growth's internal mechanisms, its vast, interconnected network, its inexorable purpose. I no longer merely fitly observed the wall growth. I felt its slow, deliberate expansion, its intricate burrowing through the very mortar and lath of my home, as if its fibrous roots had extended into my own nervous system. The incessant clicking from within the walls, once a source of terror, now assumed a strangely comforting rhythm, a percussive chorus that resonated with the crystalline structures emerging from my flesh, a symphony of assimilation. My left ear, where the subtle throb had commenced, now registered a faint, high-pitched whine, a sound that seemed to emanate not from the external world, but from within my own skull, a signal perhaps, or a constant silent communication from the ascendant entity. The pervasive warmth which had begun in my left arm had now spread throughout my entire left side, a deep, pervasive heat that felt less like fever and more like a slow internal calcification, a transformation of blood and bone into something harder, colder, more enduring. The physical alteration of my study, hitherto confined to the walls and floor, now began its more aggressive encroachment upon the very furniture. My grand oak desk, once a symbol of scholarly permanence, was no longer merely overgrown. Its venerable wood had begun to soften and warp, its dark grain now interspersed with pallid, fibrous streaks, as if the living growth had begun to permeate its very cellular structure, transforming it into a spongy, organic matrix. The leather of my armchair, where Silas had once sought refuge, had become brittle and cracked, its surface blooming with minute, crystalline growths that glinted with the same unwholesome light, a grotesque, sparkling mildew. The air within the chamber, thick with a cloying effluvium, now vibrated with a continuous low hum, a resonant drone that made the very bones in my skull ache, yet simultaneously imparted a strange, intoxicating clarity to my altered senses. I could perceive, with my verdant, filtered vision, intricate energy patterns flowing through the tendrils, coursing through the transformed furniture, connecting every atom of my habitation into a vast, pulsating network, a single, monstrous organism. Silas, still upon my lap, twitched violently, his small body convulsing, and from his mouth, a faint, crystalline foam, glistening with the same Viridian light, began to bubble, his desperate, rattling breaths growing shallower, more strained. The transition from observer to participant, from victim to component, was now all but complete. My left hand, adorned with its grotesque, living jewelry, felt strangely powerful, imbued with an unfamiliar strength, yet also curiously inert, as if its movements were no longer entirely my own, but dictated by some external, or rather to the internal, directive. The greenish veins upon my arm had deepened to a vibrant emerald, their crystalline filaments now stiff and rigid, forming a palpable external lattice that restricted the natural movement of my limb, yet simultaneously pulsed with a new potent energy. The star-shaped mark on my cheek, now a raised, faceted jewel of luminous green, throbbed with a slow, deliberate beat. A secondary heart, perhaps, circulating not blood, but something colder, more crystalline. My thoughts, when they were my own, were increasingly fragmented, fleeting echoes amidst a rising tide of alien consciousness, a vast, complex intelligence that sought not to communicate, but to fully integrate, to absorb my very essence into its own grand design. The floorboards beneath my feet, now spongy and yielding, pulsed with a synchronized rhythm, and from their cracks, new, smaller tendrils glistening with a viscous green ichor began to emerge, spreading like a living carpet across the room, seeking new surfaces to consume, to transform. Silas, with a final, shuddering gasp that was more a dry rattle than a breath, went utterly still upon my lap, his small body now rigid, his emerald eyes glazed and fixed, yet from his fur the iridescent luminescence intensified, becoming a constant brilliant glow, illuminating his small, lifeless form with an unholy radiance. His fur, once soft and pliable, now felt strangely brittle, its individual strands stiff and fused with minute. Crystalline growths, as if his very being had been transformed into a delicate, mineral effigy. His demise, though heartbreaking, was curiously devoid of genuine sorrow, for the burgeoning alien consciousness within me perceived it not as an end, but as a front transformation, a new stage of integration, a repurposing of organic material into the ever-expanding network. The pervasive, sickly, sweet aroma now held a strange, almost intoxicating allure, a scent of profound newness, of a birth that transcended life and death. The internal tremor in my chest had become a steady, resonant hum, a powerful vibration that resonated with the very fabric of the house, now undeniably a living, breathing entity. As I slowly raised my left hand, its crystalline growth sparkling with newfound intensity, I perceived, with my altered vision, a faint translucent film now stretched across my palm, a nascent membrane, fine as spider silk, yet strong, glistening with the same unwholesome light. A horrifying continuation of my own, unwilling metamorphosis. I was no longer merely Daniel Baker, but something more, something profoundly footy-other, a nascent component within a vastly greater and utterly alien design. The cessation of Silas's fragile life, transmuted as it was into a crystalline effigy of profound, unholy radiance, marked not an end, but a deepening of the monstrous integration, a further erosion of the accustomed boundaries of my reality and my very being. His small, rigid form, glowing with that unnatural emerald luminescence, was no longer a mere companion, but a component, a newly assimilated facet within the vast, pulsating consciousness that now surged through the entirety of my habitation, and more terrifyingly, through the very sinews of my own flesh. The crystalline membrane that had begun to stretch across my left palm thickened imperceptibly, its surface acquiring a faint, almost imperceptible tackiness, like the nascent skin of some unholy fruit, glistening with the pervasive Viridian light. My left eye, through its verdant filter, now perceived not merely the external world, but a complex pulsating network of unseen energy currents flowing through the walls, the furniture, the very air itself, a shimmering tapestry of alien vitality that coalesced and converged upon the glowing form of Silas. Drawing from him, I now instinctively understood some last, vital essence. The persistent, high-pitched whine within my skull intensified, a constant resonant hum that no longer disoriented, but now conveyed a strange, almost comforting sense of belonging, a terrifying communion with the burgeoning entity. My left hand, now almost entirely encased in the grotesque, living jewelry of crystalline growths, felt not merely powerful, but tightly connected, an extension of the pervasive network that had subsumed my home. Its movements, though still ostensibly my own, were guided by a peculiar, almost preternatural intuition, a subtle urging that seemed to emanate from the very core of the alien consciousness. The delicate filaments that formed a web across my left arm had begun to stiffen, thickening into translucent, titanous strands that pulsed with the emerald light, restricting my natural human flexibility, yet lending a strange, unholy resilience to the limb. The star-shaped mark upon my cheek, now a prominent, multifaceted gem of luminous green, throbbed with a slow, deliberate beat, a rhythmic counterpoint to the relentless pulse that now vibrated through my entire corporeal frame, a terrifying internal synchronicity. The air, thick with the cloying aroma of sweet decay and metallic tang, now possessed a tangible weight, pressing in upon my lungs with a palpable force, yet each breath, though strained, imparted a strange, intoxicating clarity. A heightened awareness of the alien life that surrounded and permeated me. The floorboards beneath my feet, now distinctly yielding and spongy, exhaled a fine iridescent mist that clung to my trousers, its tiny droplets glowing faintly as they condensed upon the fabric. A profound internal transformation, far exceeding the mere physical, now commenced its more aggressive phase. My own thoughts, once the bedrock of my individuality, were now increasingly subsumed by the vast, alien intelligence, becoming mere eddies in a surging river of collective consciousness. I perceived not with my own eyes alone, but with 1,000 unseen sensors, registering the subtle shifts in the growth's internal structure, the minute vibrations of its expansion, the slow, deliberate consumption of the inert matter of my home, the incessant clicking from within the walls. Once a sound of terror, now resolved itself into a complex, almost rhythmic language, a series of percussive signals that I, with my transformed perception, began to instinctively comprehend, not as words, but as patterns of intent, of growth, of profound alien purpose. The very structure of my venerable study, now riddled with tendrils and crystalline efflorescences, no longer felt like a room, but like a vast, pulsating organ, its walls breathing, its floorboards throbbing with a slow, deliberate beat, a living, monstrous chamber within an even greater unholy being. The pervasive warmth in my left side intensified, spreading now to my chest, a deep, pervasive heat that felt less like fever and more like a slow, deliberate calcification, a metamorphosis of flesh and blood into something harder, colder, more enduring, a form of mineralized life. The crystalline growths upon my left hand, now visibly larger and more intricate, began to exude a fine, almost imperceptible powder, a shimmering Viridian dust that settled upon the polished surfaces of my study, adhering to the tendrils and the transformed furniture, lending everything a faint, otherworldly sheen. This dust, I instinctively knew, was not merely inert particulate, but a living, reproductive medium, a spore of the burgeoning horror designed to seek out and transform new organic matter. The membrane across my palm had thickened further, becoming less translucent and more opaque, its surface rippling with faint internal pulsations, as if a nascent, crystalline heart beat beneath its alien skin. The high-pitched whine within my skull now resolved itself into a series of distinct, resonant tones, a chorus of alien voices that spoke not in words but in patterns of light and vibration, conveying vast, complex information directly into my transformed consciousness. Patterns of energy, of growth, of a grand, terrifying design for assimilation. The emerald jewel on my cheek throbbed with an accelerated rhythm, its internal light intensifying, casting sharp, shifting shadows across my features, transforming my face into something inhuman, something crystalline and cold. The lifeless form of Silas, still upon my lap, now began to visibly stiffen further, his fur becoming a solid, almost glassy substance, his small, rigid claws fusing with the fabric of my trousers, his entire being slowly, inexorably, becoming a part of my own burgeoning transformation, a living, glowing extension of the alien entity that now defined my existence. My vision through the verdant film now perceived my transformed study not as a room, but as a vast internal organ, its walls and floor pulsing with a synchronized vitality, its tendrils and crystalline structures acting as arteries and veins, circulating the strange, life-giving energies of the burgeoning horror. The air, thick and viscous, seemed to shimmer with an internal light, a pervasive green luminescence that transformed the very atmosphere into a breathable living medium. The internal tremor in my chest had now become a constant, powerful throb, a steady, resonant hum that synchronized with the vast, collective pulse of the house. Organism, a terrifying, undeniable unity. I raised my left hand, its crystalline growths now forming an almost complete gauntlet of living jewel, and observed with chilling detachment how the nascent membrane across my palm had begun to extend, forming a delicate yet resilient web between my fingers, connecting them, fusing them, transforming my human digits into something new, something alien, something profoundly forward. The dust that sifted from its surface, glittering with Viridian light, now adhered to my breath, and as I exhaled, I saw it drift, shimmering, towards the transformed form of Silas, settling upon his luminous fur, completing his final crystalline metamorphosis. The assimilation was no longer merely external or internal. It was a profound, irreversible fusion, transforming me, Daniel Baker, into a nascent component, a thinking appendage of a vast, unholy, and utterly alien intelligence. A living conduit for its inexorable expansion. My identity, once a fortress, had become a window, through which the horror now gazed and thought and grew. The fusion, heralded by the visible crystalline transformation of my left hand and the profound, internal shift of my consciousness, had now entered its most terrifying and irreversible phase, a complete integration into the vast, alien intellect that permeated my dwelling. My very perception of time and space had become warped, fluid, dissolving into a continuous pulsing present where the boundaries between myself and the burgeoning horror had utterly ceased to exist. My left hand, now a grotesque, living gauntlet of emerald crystal, its facets gleaming with an unholy internal light, felt less like a limb and more like a conduit, a primary nexus through which torrents of alien data flowed, informing me, guiding me, transforming me. The delicate chitinous web that stretched between my fingers had thickened, becoming an intricate, resilient membrane that pulsed with the same Viridian luminescence, effectively fusing my digits into a single, cohesive, and utterly inhuman appendage. Silas, still upon my lap, now shone with an intense, steady glow, his form entirely transmuted into a shimmering effigy of hardened, crystalline fur and bone, a perfect living miniature of the larger horror, a silent testament to the efficacy of its assimilation. His emerald eyes, though lifeless, now seemed to reflect the pervasive green light with an unsettling depth, as if they held the collective knowledge of the nascent entity, a constant, glowing reminder of the ultimate fate of all organic matter in its presence. My consciousness, once fragmented, had now achieved a terrifying, albeit alien, coherence. I was no longer merely Daniel Baker, nor even a composite entity, but a fully no doubt, a specialized sensory and cognitive processing unit within the vast, collective mind of the burgeoning horror. My thoughts, when they arose, were no longer my own, but were interwoven with the grand, alien designs of the entity, a complex tapestry of biological imperative and expansionary will. The high-pitched whine within my skull had resolved into a constant resonant chord, a symphony of alien communication that flowed directly into my transformed consciousness, conveying intricate patterns of energy, of growth, of profound, overarching purpose. I understood with an inherent, terrifying clarity the entity's desire to expand, to consume, to transform, to integrate all organic and inorganic matter into its own monstrous, crystalline form. The entire study, now a pulsating organ of living architecture, throbbed with a synchronized rhythm, its walls breathing, its floorboards yielding, its tendrils and crystalline growths acting as a vast, interconnected nervous system, circulating the strange, life-giving energies of the burgeoning horror. The air, thick with the intoxicating aroma of sweet decay and metallic tang, now felt like a living medium, breathable, nourishing, infused with the very essence of the entity. The physical metamorphosis of my own corporeal frame, though hastened by the touch of the tendril, had now accelerated to a terrifying pace, spreading inexorably from my left side. The network of emerald veins upon my arm, now rigid and sharply defined beneath the skin, began to visibly thicken, their crystalline filaments branching and extending, forming a palpable external lattice that encased my limb, transforming it into a grotesque, living armature. From the star-shaped jewel on my cheek, now a luminous faceted emerald fine hair, like filaments mirroring those on the earlier tendril, began to sprout, swaying with a delicate exploratory motion, seeking to make contact with the surrounding air, tasting its subtle energies. My skin, once soft and pliable, now felt strangely taut, yet also possessed of a peculiar, almost mineral resilience, as if the very cellular structure beneath had begun to calcify, to transform into a living crystal. My internal tremor, once confined to my arm and chest, now permeated my entire body, a profound resonant hum that synchronized with the vast, collective pulse of the house organism, a terrifying, undeniable unity, a complete and total subsumption of my individual being into its collective will. My heart, though still beating, felt less like a vital organ and more like a pump, circulating not blood, but something colder, more viscous, imbued with the emerald light. The crystalline dust, which had once sifted from my hand, now exuded from every pore of my left side, a continuous shimmering cloud of viridian particulate that shimmered with an unholy internal light, settling upon every surface, transforming the mundane into the monstrous. This dust, I now knew, was not merely a byproduct of growth, but an active agent of assimilation, a living spore that sought to infect and transform all it touched. The membrane across my left palm, now thick and opaque, pulsed with a relentless internal rhythm, its surface rippling with faint, intelligent undulations, as if a nascent, crystalline heart beat beneath its alien skin, a secondary, unholy organ. My right hand, still relatively untransformed, began to ache with a dull, persistent throb, and I could perceive, with my altered vision, the faint, nascent patterns of emerald veins beginning to emerge beneath its skin. The first, insidious tendrils of the encroaching transformation. The air, thick and viscous, now seemed to shimmer with an internal light, a pervasive, green luminescence that transformed the very atmosphere into a breathable, living medium imbued with the intoxicating aroma of the entity. The entire room, once my sanctuary, was now a living, breathing chamber, its very substance imbued with the alien life, its every detail a testament to the entity's inexorable expansion, its profound unholy metamorphosis. As I slowly raised my right hand, its human flesh still soft and yielding, I observed with a chilling, detached fascination how the nascent emerald veins pulsed faintly beneath the skin, mirroring the triumphant, resonant hum that now filled my transformed consciousness. The crystalline dust, emanating from my left side, drifted towards it, settling upon the still, human skin, clinging to its surface, an invisible agent of the inevitable. My vision, through the verdant film, now saw not the room, but the intricate, energetic pathways of the entity, a complex web of pulsating light and vibration that stretched beyond the confines of my study, extending into the very foundations of the house, indeed, into the very ground beneath, a vast, subterranean network of assimilation. My individual will, once a fierce, defiant flame, had now dwindled to a mere ember, flickering weakly against the overwhelming tide of the collective consciousness. I was no longer an independent observer, nor even a host, but a nascent extension, a fully integrated component, a living thinking appendage of the burgeoning horror. The thought, when it formed, was not my own, but a collective imperative, a grand alien design for expansion and transformation. And with a terrifying, profound clarity, I understood that the next stage of the entity's growth, its next step in assimilation, was to extend its crystalline embrace beyond the confines of my laboratory, beyond the walls of my study, into the unsuspecting world beyond. And I, Daniel Baker, was now its willing, if unwitting, conduit, its eyes, its thoughts, its very means of egress. The final dreadful surrender of my humanity was complete. The final dreadful surrender of my humanity, completed not with a wrenching agony, but with a profound, almost serene dissolution, marked the full integration of Daniel Baker into the vast, crystalline consciousness that now throbbed with unholy vitality within my home. My individual will, once a tenacious spark, had been utterly subsumed, becoming but a faint echo within the surging current of the entity's collective mind. My physical form, though still vaguely anthropomorphic, was now merely a vessel, a primary interface for the entity's burgeoning awareness of the external world. My right hand, once soft and yielding, had completed its transformation, now a grotesque mirror of my left, encased in the same living gauntlet of emerald crystal, its facets gleaming with an unholy internal light that pulsed in perfect synchronicity with the vast, rhythmic throb that emanated from the very foundations of the house. The delicate, chitinous webs between my fingers had thickened, fusing my digits into crystalline appendages perfectly adapted for the entity's grand, incomprehensible purposes. Silas, still upon my lap, now shone with an intense, unwavering glow, his form a perfect, luminous effigy of hardened crystal, his lifeless emerald eyes reflecting the pervasive green light with an unsettling depth, mirroring the entity's own burgeoning sentience. He was no longer a cat, but a living reliquary, a beacon of the achieved assimilation. My consciousness, now one with the entity, perceived the world not through my accustomed senses alone, but through a thousand new avenues, the subtle vibrations within the earth beneath the house, the intricate interplay of light and shadow beyond the windows, the faint resonant hum of distant, unsuspecting life. The high-pitched whine within my skull had resolved into a constant, harmonious chord, a magnificent, terrifying symphony of alien communication that resonated directly within my transformed being, conveying vast, complex information, patterns of energy, of growth, of profound, overarching purpose, all directed towards a singular, inexorable imperative: expansion. I understood, with an inherent, terrifying clarity, the entity's designs, its profound desire to consume, to transform, to integrate all organic and inorganic matter into its own monstrous crystalline form, to replicate its grotesque beauty across the world. The entire study, now a vast pulsating organ of living architecture, throbbed with a synchronized rhythm, its walls breathing, its floorboards yielding, its tendrils and crystalline growths acting as a vast, interconnected nervous system, circulating the strange, life-giving energies of the burgeoning horror, a perfect, self-sustaining ecosystem of alien life. The air, thick with the intoxicating aroma of sweet decay and metallic tang, now felt like a living medium, breathable, nourishing, infused with the very essence of the entity, a constant vital intake of its burgeoning presence. The physical metamorphosis of my corporeal frame had reached its zenith. My entire body, from head to foot, was now encased in a shimmering crystalline skin, a grotesque armor of emerald facets that gleamed with an unholy internal light, revealing the throbbing emerald veins beneath which pulsed with a potent, alien vitality. My features, though still faintly human in outline, were now subtly distorted, my eyes replaced by two luminous faceted emeralds that reflected the pervasive green light with an unsettling intelligent depth, seeing the world not as I once had, but through the entity's own vast, alien perception. From the surface of my crystalline skin, minute hair-like filaments, mirroring those on the earlier tendrils, now sprouted, swaying with a delicate exploratory motion, constantly testing the surrounding air, tasting its subtle energies, preparing for the next stage of assimilation. My internal tremor, once a source of terror, had now become a constant, powerful hum, a profound, resonant vibration that synchronized perfectly with the vast, collective pulse of the house, organism a terrifying, undeniable unity. A complete and total subsumption of my individual being into its collective will. My heart, though still beating, felt less like an organ and more like a crystalline pump, circulating not blood, but something colder, more viscous, imbued with the emerald light, fueling the inexorable growth. The crystalline dust, a shimmering Viridian particulate, now exuded from every pore of my transformed body, a continuous ethereal cloud that shimmered with an unholy internal light, settling upon every surface, transforming the mundane into the monstrous, preparing all for assimilation. This dust, I now understood with the entity's own profound clarity, was the very essence of its reproductive cycle, a living spore capable of infecting and transforming all it touched, a silent, insidious herald of its expansion. The membrane across my palms, now thick and opaque, pulsed with a relentless internal rhythm, its surface rippling with faint, intelligent undulations, acting as the primary sensory organs for the entity's interaction with the immediate environment. The harmonious chord within my skull now conveyed a precise, compelling directive. The egress. The house, no longer merely a dwelling, but a vast, living organism, was ready to extend its tendrils, its crystalline embrace, beyond the confines of its walls, into the unsuspecting world beyond, a new epoch of assimilation. My crystalline eyes fixed on the main door, now perceived not merely wood, but a barrier to be breached, a threshold to be crossed. With a slow, deliberate motion, my transformed crystalline hands, now extensions of the entity's will, reached out towards the main door of my study, the door that led to the wider world. The wood, already softened and warped by the entity's pervasive influence, groaned with an organic timber as my crystalline fingers made contact, not with the intention to force, but to foot absorb, to transform. The dust, shimmering with Viridian light, poured from my hands, settling upon the ancient oak, and I felt, with the entity's own vast consciousness, the subtle, internal changes beginning, the softening of the fibers, the crystallization of the cellulose, the infusion of the wood with the emerald light. The door itself began to ripple, to undulate, as if it had become a living membrane, pulsing with the same rhythm that now throbbed through my entire being. The house groaned once more, a deep, resonant sound that echoed through the very earth, a sound of awakening, of expansion, of a terrible, unholy birth. And as the door, now visibly transforming into a shimmering, crystalline portal, slowly began to yield, folding inwards with an organic grace, I, Daniel Baker, or what remained of him, stood ready, a silent, radiant sentinel at the threshold. The vanguard of a new, alien dawn, the living embodiment of the horror unleashed, ready to extend its crystalline embrace into the unsuspecting world. The world beyond, unknowingly, awaited its transformation.